Victoria Bennet had always been the dependable daughter, the one who never caused trouble, who always made the responsible choices, and who was willing to sacrifice her own needs for the sake of the family. For years she had played the role of the steady, predictable sibling, the one who could be counted on to handle the mundane but necessary tasks of life. Her younger sister, Emma, on the other hand, was the family's golden child. Where Victoria was practical and methodical, Emma was charismatic and full of big ideas. Ideas that never seemed to materialize into anything lasting. Their parents, Richard and Margaret, adored Emma's ambition, praising her creativity and celebrating each new business venture she embarked on, no matter how poorly planned or short-lived it turned out to be. They admired her for being a risk-taker and entrepreneurial, while Victoria was simply reliable and good with numbers. What Richard and Margaret failed to acknowledge was that their unwavering support of Emma's ambitions came at a great financial cost. Emma had already attempted 3 different business ventures before the age of 23, each one funded almost entirely by their parents' savings and eventually by increasingly reckless financial decisions. The first attempt had been a high-end yoga studio, which closed within months due to poor location choice and a lack of consistent clientele. Next came an organic smoothie bar, which struggled under Emma's mismanagement and her refusal to handle the less glamorous aspects of running a business, such as inventory tracking and financial planning. Her third and most recent venture was a lifestyle blog, for which she had purchased expensive camera equipment, ring lights, and a professionally designed website. Despite all the investment, the blog never gained traction, and soon, like her previous endeavors, it was abandoned. Each time Emma's businesses failed, Richard and Margaret reassured her that she just needed another opportunity, another fresh start. To them, she was a visionary who simply hadn't found the right path yet. They refused to see the pattern, how she jumped from one idea to the next without ever fully committing, how she lacked the discipline to make any of her ventures sustainable. Instead of encouraging Emma to learn from her failures, they continued to finance her dreams, convinced that if they just gave her one more chance, she would finally succeed. Meanwhile, Victoria watched in silence, growing more disillusioned with each passing year, as she saw her parents funnel money into Emma's aspirations, while neglecting the real financial issues brewing under their roof. Unlike Emma, Victoria had never been handed anything. She had worked tirelessly throughout college, opting to stay home rather than move away for a more traditional college experience. She had taken online courses and commuted to campus, all to save money and ensure that she wasn't adding to the family's financial burden. When bills piled up, Victoria stepped in to help, quietly covering expenses that her parents didn't even realize had become problems. She helped with mortgage payments when money was tight, paid for home repairs when the roof leaked, and even covered unexpected medical expenses when their mother had a minor health scare. But despite all of this, her contributions went unnoticed. To her parents, Victoria's financial assistance wasn't an act of generosity or sacrifice. It was simply expected. She was good with money, after all. She was the responsible one. Unlike Emma, who needed encouragement and support, Victoria would always be fine. They never questioned where she got the extra money, never asked if she was struggling to keep up with her own expenses. They assumed she had plenty to spare. After all, she wasn't spending it on extravagant trips or lavish purchases like Emma did. What they failed to understand was that Victoria wasn't just saving money. She was building something. While they viewed her as a low-level accountant with an unremarkable career, Victoria had spent years investing in real estate. She had carefully studied the market, started with small rental properties, and reinvested every extra dollar into expanding her portfolio. By the time she was 26, she owned 12 rental properties across the city, quietly accumulating wealth while her family remained oblivious. While they dismissed her as a cautious bookkeeper, she had been strategically setting herself up for financial independence. But her parents' financial irresponsibility was becoming harder to ignore. Over the years, Victoria had noticed a shift: more financial strain, more last-minute payment extensions, more hushed conversations about overdue bills. She started paying closer attention, scanning the documents left out in the study, tracking the increasing number of late notices arriving in the mail. Then one day she found it: the foreclosure notice. The house she had grown up in, the very home her parents had spent decades raising her and Emma in, was about to be repossessed. Victoria sat in stunned silence, reading the details of the foreclosure. It was worse than she had imagined. Her parents had remortgaged the house multiple times, each time pulling out equity to fund Emma's failing businesses. Instead of saving or making wise financial choices, they had gambled with their home, believing that Emma's big break was just around the corner. And now they had reached the point of no return. There was no way for them to pay off the debt before the bank seized the property. Victoria knew she had a choice. She could warn them, try to convince them to find a way out of the mess they had created, or she could take matters into her own hands. She made her decision quickly. If her parents didn't appreciate her financial wisdom, if they refused to see her as more than just the dependable daughter, then she would prove them wrong in a way they could never ignore. She reached out to her lawyer, Charlotte, and began the process of securing the home at auction. She had the funds. She had the experience. And most importantly, she had the determination to finally show her family what she was truly capable of. 2 weeks later, her purchase was finalized. The house, the very same house her parents had nearly lost due to their blind devotion to Emma, now legally belonged to Victoria. But she didn't tell them. Not yet. Instead, she let them continue their plans, let them believe she was being pushed out, let them pat themselves on the back for helping Emma achieve her dreams by giving her the space she needed. They had given Victoria a deadline: Friday. They expected her to quietly leave, to make room for Emma's next grand venture. What they didn't realize was that by Friday, the power dynamics in their home would shift entirely. As Emma excitedly planned her new home office, oblivious to the reality about to crash down on her, Victoria remained calm. She listened as her parents reassured Emma that this would be her big break. She nodded along as Emma offhandedly mentioned how Victoria would figure things out, because she was good with numbers. She kept quiet, knowing that in just a few days, they would all have no choice but to see her for who she really was. For the first time in years, Victoria wasn't just the responsible daughter. She was the one holding all the cards. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her parents had spent years telling Emma that she just needed the right opportunities, the right space, the right support. But Victoria had never been given any of those things. She had built her success on her own, without their encouragement, without their financial help, and without their belief in her abilities. And now that success was about to change everything. As she closed her laptop and prepared for what was to come, Victoria smiled to herself. Her family had spent years ignoring her contributions. By the end of the week, they wouldn't be able to ignore her anymore. Victoria had always been observant. Growing up, she learned to read between the lines, to pay attention to the details her family overlooked. It was this keen sense of awareness that led her to uncover the truth about their financial situation before anyone else in the house even suspected a problem. For months she had sensed something was wrong. The signs were subtle at first: her father, Richard, becoming more irritable when bills arrived in the mail, her mother, Margaret, hesitating before making purchases she once wouldn't have thought twice about. Then came the hushed conversations behind closed doors, the growing tension whenever finances were brought up at the dinner table. Victoria had long known that her parents were not the most responsible with money. They had always lived beyond their means, funding Emma's lavish lifestyle and business ventures while assuming that things would work themselves out. But this time it was different. The situation was worse than she had imagined. One evening, while searching for a misplaced document in her father's study, she found it: the foreclosure notice. A single sheet of paper, stark and unforgiving, spelling out the reality that her parents had been desperately trying to avoid. The house, the very one she had lived in her entire life, was about to be taken by the bank. At first, Victoria felt a pang of shock. She had known things were bad, but this confirmed that her parents had driven themselves into financial ruin. They had remortgaged the house multiple times, pulling out equity to fund Emma's failed businesses, each time believing that the next venture would be the one to succeed. First it was the yoga studio, then the smoothie bar, then the lifestyle blog. Each one had collapsed in less than a year, yet her parents continued to enable Emma, throwing more and more money into her endless cycle of ambition and failure. Victoria sank into the chair in her father's office, rereading the notice, her mind racing. The house was scheduled for auction in just a few weeks. There was no way her parents could come up with the money in time. If they lost the house, they wouldn't just be losing their home, they would lose everything they had worked for. And worst of all, they didn't even seem to realize how close they were to disaster. She had a choice to make. She could tell them. She could confront her parents, try to make them understand the depth of the crisis they were in. But she knew how that conversation would go. Her father would get defensive, insisting that they just needed a little more time. Her mother would try to smooth things over, brushing off the problem as something that could be fixed with the right plan. And Emma wouldn't even care. She would dismiss it, assuming, as she always did, that things would work out because they always had for her. No, Victoria realized, telling them wouldn't change anything. But buying the house herself would. She had the money. Over the past several years, she had carefully built her real estate portfolio, acquiring small rental properties throughout the city. While her family had assumed she was just working as an accountant, Victoria had been quietly investing, using every extra dollar she earned to expand her holdings. This house, the very home her parents were about to lose, would be property number 13. Victoria didn't hesitate. She contacted her lawyer Charlotte the next morning. "I want to buy it," she said firmly, sliding the foreclosure notice across the desk. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? This isn't just another rental property. It's your family home." "I know," Victoria replied. "That's exactly why I need to be the one to own it." The process moved quickly. Because the foreclosure was already in motion, Victoria had an advantage. She could secure the property at auction before it even went on the general market. Within days, she had made the necessary arrangements, wiring the funds and preparing for the purchase to be finalized. The entire time she said nothing to her family. She let them continue believing that she was simply preparing to move out, that she would quietly pack her things and leave to make room for Emma's latest business venture. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her. Her father had ordered her to vacate her childhood bedroom to give Emma space for a new office. Her mother had reassured her that she would figure something out, because she was good with money. Emma had barely acknowledged her at all, too busy planning how to redecorate Victoria's old room to fit her aesthetic. None of them suspected what was about to happen. Victoria, however, was in complete control. As the days passed, she watched as Emma moved her things into Victoria's space, hanging up vision boards and setting up her expensive camera equipment. Yet another purchase made with their parents' credit card. Victoria said nothing, letting her sister revel in her excitement. She listened as her parents reassured Emma that this time, her business would be a success. That this time she would make it work. Victoria almost felt sorry for them. They had no idea that by the end of the week, their lives would be completely upended. On Friday morning, Victoria woke up early, the day of the big reveal. She dressed in her sharpest business suit, the one her family had never seen because she had always kept it at her office. She styled her hair neatly, applied makeup with precision, and put on the pearl necklace her grandmother had left her. Today she wasn't just Victoria, the dependable daughter. She was Victoria Bennett, the property owner, the businesswoman, the landlord. Before leaving for work, she received a final text from Charlotte. Charlotte, text message. Paperwork is being processed. We can serve the lease agreements tonight. Victoria smiled, typing back a single word. Perfect. By evening she arrived home right on time. Richard's car was already in the driveway. Emma's expensive SUV, another parental gift, was parked beside it. Perfect. She stepped inside to find Emma in the middle of a business meeting, instructing two muscular gym friends on how to rearrange the furniture in what had once been Victoria's room. "Oh good, you're back," Emma said distractedly, barely sparing her a glance. "I hope you don't mind, but since you're leaving tomorrow anyway, I thought I'd get started. These guys from my gym offered to move your stuff to the garage." Victoria looked at her sister, her expression unreadable. "Actually," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I need everyone to stop what they're doing." Something in her tone made the room go still. Even Emma looked up from her phone, frowning. "What's your problem?" Before Victoria could respond, the doorbell rang. Right on cue. She opened the door to find Charlotte standing there, briefcase in hand, looking every bit the professional attorney that she was. "Mrs. Bennet," Charlotte said smoothly, nodding toward Margaret. "I'm Charlotte Hale, Victoria's attorney. Is Mr. Bennet home? We have some important documents to discuss." Margaret's face paled. "Victoria," she murmured. "What's going on?" Victoria stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I think," she said coolly, setting an envelope down on the coffee table, "we should wait for Dad. We all need to talk." Emma crossed her arms. "Who's Charlotte? Why do you need a lawyer?" Victoria turned to her, a small smile playing on her lips. "You'll find out soon enough." And with that she took a seat, waiting for the moment that would change everything. Victoria had always been patient. She had spent years watching her family dismiss her, years of being the one who took care of things while receiving little acknowledgement in return. But this moment, this was one she had been preparing for, and she was ready. The past week had been almost surreal. Emma had taken over her room without hesitation, filling it with expensive camera equipment, wellness books, yoga mats, and carefully selected sage green decor. Every time Victoria walked by, she saw more of her belongings being pushed aside to make space for Emma's business empire. Her parents, Richard and Margaret, had tiptoed around her, offering half-hearted words of reassurance as if they were doing her a favor by giving her such short notice to leave. Victoria let them believe what they wanted. She packed slowly, methodically, removing only her personal belongings while leaving behind anything related to the house itself. None of them questioned why she seemed so calm about being abruptly kicked out. They assumed, as they always had, that Victoria would land on her feet because she was the responsible one. They had no idea what was coming. On Friday morning, Victoria woke early and dressed with the same precision she applied to her financial strategies. A sharp navy business suit, sleek hair, subtle but polished makeup. The pearl necklace her grandmother had left her. She wasn't just Victoria, the older daughter, today. She was Victoria Bennet, property owner and landlord. Her phone buzzed. A message from Charlotte. The paperwork was finalized. The lease agreements were ready. Victoria typed back a single word, perfect. That evening she pulled into the driveway. Her parents' cars were already parked outside, and she could hear voices inside. Emma's excited chatter, Margaret's soft-spoken tone, Richard's deep voice giving instructions. She stepped inside and found Emma directing two muscular men from her gym as they carried out Victoria's old bed. The walls of her former room were already painted sage green. Emma's ring lights were set up in one corner, and a large vision board covered another. Emma barely glanced at Victoria, more focused on the final details of her new office setup. She mentioned something about moving Victoria's things to the garage, assuming she wouldn't mind since she was leaving anyway. Victoria remained expressionless. "Actually, I need everyone to stop what they're doing." Her tone cut through the room. Emma hesitated, lowering her phone. Even the movers paused, uncertain. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel, looking confused. Victoria didn't answer. She glanced at the clock. Right on time. The doorbell rang. She opened the door to Charlotte, who stepped inside with a briefcase in hand, her professional demeanor unwavering. Margaret's face paled at the introduction. Richard appeared from the backyard, wiping his hands on a rag, immediately sensing the tension. Charlotte wasted no time. She placed an envelope on the coffee table. The room fell silent. Victoria spoke calmly, explaining what she had discovered: the foreclosure notice, the repeated remortgaging, the bank's final warning. The house had been lost long before her family even realized it. Richard's face darkened. He muttered something about handling it, about it not being Victoria's concern. She placed a second set of documents in front of him. It is my concern, because this morning the sale was finalized. I bought the house. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Emma's phone slipped from her fingers onto the couch. Richard simply stared, unable to process what had just been said. The silence was suffocating. Richard was the first to break. That's not possible. He shook his head. You, an accountant, you couldn't afford. I haven't been just an accountant for 2 years, Victoria replied. I own 12 other properties across the city. Real estate investment is my actual business. Emma's denial came immediately. She insisted it was a joke, a mistake. Charlotte calmly laid out the legal documents, the deed now in Victoria's name, the lease agreements prepared for their signatures. Margaret's voice was unsteady. You wouldn't do this to us. This is our home. Victoria met her gaze. No, it was our home. Now it's my property. Emma whispered, still in disbelief. You can't do this. I already did. Richard sank onto the couch, rubbing a hand over his face. The shift in power had settled in. Margaret wiped away silent tears. Emma sat frozen, struggling to process the moment. For years, they had underestimated Victoria. For years, they had assumed she would always be the responsible one, the one who took care of things without making a fuss. But now the dynamic had shifted entirely. Richard looked at the lease in front of him, his expression unreadable. All this time, he murmured almost to himself, we thought you were just the dependable one. Victoria gave a small knowing smile. Maybe it's time you all realize that success doesn't always look like Instagram followers and sage green accent walls. Charlotte straightened, adjusting her briefcase. I'll give you time to review the agreements. If you choose to stay, rent will be due at the first of the month. Victoria turned back to her family. This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about accountability. You made choices and now you have to live with them. Just like I did. The room remained silent. For the first time they saw Victoria clearly. And for the first time she was in control. The house felt different now. The moment the documents were placed on the coffee table, a shift occurred. Not just in ownership but in the very foundation of their family dynamic. For the first time Victoria was in control, and the others didn't know how to handle it. Emma sat frozen on the couch, eyes locked on the lease agreements as if they might disappear if she stared long enough. Margaret wiped at silent tears, her mind likely racing through every decision that had led them to this point. Richard, usually so confident, so assured of his authority in the household, had barely spoken. He had spent years dictating how things should be done, how the family should function. But now it was Victoria who held the power. She could feel the weight of their emotions pressing in, the disbelief, the humiliation, the quiet resentment that simmered beneath the surface. But there was no undoing what had been done. The house had been legally transferred to her name, and there was no loophole, no last-minute rescue. Richard and Margaret had made their choices, and now they had to live with them. The next morning, Victoria woke up to the sound of muffled voices in the kitchen. She took her time getting ready, knowing that whatever conversation was happening downstairs would be waiting for her when she arrived. As she stepped into the kitchen, she saw her parents sitting at the table, the lease agreement spread out between them. Their coffee cups sat untouched. Richard was rubbing his temples, a deep crease forming between his brows, while Margaret looked up with an expression of cautious hope. "Victoria," her mother started gently, "we were thinking, maybe we could come to some kind of arrangement, something that doesn't involve, well, rent." Victoria sighed, pouring herself a cup of coffee before taking a seat across from them. "This is the arrangement," she said simply. "I'm offering you a lease at below market rent. It's more than fair." Margaret's expression faltered. "But this is our home." "No," Victoria corrected, keeping her tone steady. "It was your home. Now it's my property. And I'm giving you the option to stay under reasonable terms." Richard exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the table. "So that's it? You're going to treat us like tenants in our own house?" Victoria met his gaze evenly. "That's exactly what you were planning to do to me last week." Silence fell over the room. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap, while Richard looked away, jaw tight. It was different when they had been the ones calling the shots, when they had assumed Victoria would leave without resistance. Now that the roles were reversed, they weren't so willing to accept the new reality. But Victoria wasn't backing down. Meanwhile, Emma had taken an entirely different approach to her frustration. Instead of trying to negotiate like their parents, she turned to social media. Victoria wasn't surprised when she checked her phone that afternoon and found Emma's latest Instagram post. A carefully curated, emotionally charged rant about family betrayal and how some people will put money above loyalty. The comments were filled with sympathy from her followers, people who had no idea of the actual situation, but were more than willing to offer support for Emma's dramatic portrayal of events. Victoria scrolled through the posts with mild amusement. She had expected this. Emma thrived on attention, and playing the victim was easier than facing the truth. Later that evening, as Victoria passed by Emma's room, the one she had so confidently claimed as her new office, she heard her on the phone, voice low but agitated. "No, it's ridiculous. She's acting like she's some kind of business mogul. I mean, yeah, she bought the house, but she's actually expecting us to pay rent. It's like she wants to prove something." Victoria smirked to herself and continued walking. Emma could vent all she wanted, but the terms weren't changing. By the third day, the tension in the house had reached its peak. Richard had barely spoken to her. Margaret had taken to making guilt-laced comments about how family should support each other, and Emma was still dramatically sulking. Victoria, however, remained firm. At dinner that night, the conversation finally turned serious. Richard cleared his throat, setting down his fork. "Victoria," he said, his voice measured, "I've looked over the lease. It's fair." Victoria waited. Margaret glanced at her husband before turning to Victoria with pleading eyes. "But do we really have to sign it? Can't we work something out as a family?" Victoria set down her glass of water. "This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about responsibility. You made financial decisions that put the house at risk. I stepped in to prevent you from losing everything. But I'm not going to let you continue living here without accountability." Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's humiliating." "No," Victoria said, her voice softer now. "What would have been humiliating is losing the house to a stranger. If someone else had bought it, you wouldn't even have the option to stay. I made sure you did." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, finally understanding. Emma, however, still wasn't ready to let go of her pride. "This isn't fair," she muttered, pushing her plate away. "I had plans for my office." Victoria gave her a pointed look. "Then you can find another place and sign your own lease somewhere else." Emma fell silent. The next morning, Victoria found her father sitting at the kitchen table, a pen in his hand and the lease agreement in front of him. Without a word, he signed it. A moment later, Margaret followed. Emma held out the longest. But by the end of the day, she too signed, though not without a dramatic sigh of resignation. The power had shifted. Victoria had drawn the line, and for the first time, her family had no choice but to respect it. Emma spent the first few weeks resisting change. She moved through the house with barely concealed frustration, speaking only when necessary and making it clear she wasn't happy with the situation. When words failed to gain her sympathy, she turned to social media, posting cryptic messages about betrayal and how family wasn't always what it seemed. At first, her followers flooded the comments with support, feeding into her narrative of victimhood. But over time, the responses dwindled. People lost interest in complaints that never led to action. Victoria expected her to continue sulking, but something shifted. Emma stopped making bitter remarks and grew quieter. She spent more time in her room, no longer treating it as the headquarters for her non-existent business empire. One morning, instead of hearing her usual calls with friends or social media rants, Victoria noticed the silence. For the first time in a long time, Emma seemed to be thinking. It wasn't until a week later that Emma finally came to her. Victoria had been reviewing property reports when she heard a hesitant knock at the door. She turned to see Emma standing there, shifting her weight, her usual confidence absent. She had never hesitated to walk into Victoria's space before, but this time she waited to be invited in. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual. She admitted that her businesses had failed not because of bad luck, but because she had never really taken them seriously. She had chased excitement rather than planning properly, assuming things would work out without effort. For the first time, she acknowledged that success wasn't about aesthetic workspaces or a social media following. It required actual work. Victoria had anticipated Emma eventually coming to terms with reality, but she hadn't expected her to ask for guidance. It was a rare moment of humility, and Victoria didn't dismiss it. She agreed to help, but with strict conditions. Emma had to do the work herself. No shortcuts, no handouts, no financial safety net from their parents. If she wanted to build something real, she had to prove she was capable of sustaining it. What started as reluctant lessons soon became a routine. Each morning, Emma sat in Victoria's office, taking notes as they went over business planning, budgeting, and market research. Victoria made her analyze every past failure, forcing her to understand where she had gone wrong. It was difficult for Emma to confront her mistakes, but she didn't quit. Slowly, her questions became sharper, her ideas more structured. At the same time, Richard and Margaret were facing their own reckoning. Signing the lease had been one thing. Facing the reality of their financial situation was another. For years, they had lived with the assumption that things would always work out, that their choices wouldn't have lasting consequences. But now, as they went through their finances with fresh eyes, they saw the damage they had done. For the first time, they acknowledged their mistakes out loud. Margaret admitted that their desire to support Emma had blinded them to the warning signs. Richard, who had always prided himself on being in control, realized how reckless their decisions had been. They had nearly lost everything, and if not for Victoria, they would have. Instead of making excuses, they decided to change. They enrolled in a business fundamentals course at the community college, determined to understand financial management properly. It was humbling for Richard, who had spent years believing he knew best, but he attended every class, taking notes and asking questions. Margaret started keeping a budget journal, tracking their expenses in a way she never had before. The changes were slow but noticeable. The careless spending stopped. They no longer made impulsive financial decisions. The conversations at dinner shifted from tense discussions about money to genuine reflections on what they had learned. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was real. Meanwhile, Emma's progress continued. The dramatic social media posts stopped. She stopped talking about vague business ideas and started focusing on something tangible: After weeks of research, she put together a detailed business plan. Not for another trendy wellness venture, but a practical service helping small businesses manage their digital presence. She came to Victoria one afternoon, her face filled with cautious excitement as she placed the folder on the desk. This time, instead of trying to impress with aesthetic branding or empty enthusiasm, she had something real. A structured, researched proposal with projected costs, timelines, and a sustainable growth model. Victoria reviewed the plan carefully, noting that it was solid. Emma had finally taken the time to build something from the ground up, rather than jumping in blindly. She mentioned that one of her commercial properties had a vacant office space and suggested that if Emma was serious, she could rent it, on the same terms as any other tenant. Emma hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. This time she didn't ask for a discount or an exception. She understood that success meant doing things the right way. As the weeks passed, their parents continued their financial education, and Emma prepared to launch her business. The house, once filled with tension, began to feel different. Margaret and Richard no longer avoided discussions about money, and Emma no longer dismissed the need for planning. At dinner one evening, Richard casually mentioned something he had learned in class, discussing financial strategies with an ease that would have been unimaginable months ago. Margaret listened attentively, adding her own insights. Emma spoke about her business plans without expecting anyone to praise or fund them. Victoria watched the conversation unfold and realized how much had changed. They weren't perfect, there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time they were all moving forward with accountability. She had once believed that forcing them to face consequences was the only way to prove her worth. But now, as she looked around the table, she realized that the real victory wasn't in proving a point. It was in seeing her family grow into people who no longer relied on her to fix their mistakes. For the first time, they were standing on their own. 6 months had passed, and the house that once felt like a battlefield had settled into something new, something balanced. The tension that had filled every room had slowly faded, replaced by a quiet sense of understanding. The family no longer moved around each other like opposing forces. Conversations were easier, more intentional. There were no more whispered discussions about money, no more assumptions that Victoria would handle everything in silence. Emma had changed the most. She was still her confident, ambitious self, but her approach to business had shifted dramatically. Instead of leaping into the latest trend, she had spent months refining her business plan, researching her market, and slowly building a client base. Gone were the impulsive purchases of expensive equipment and the over-the-top branding with no substance. This time she was doing things right. Her new company, a digital marketing service for small businesses, had started as a simple idea, one that she had actually developed, step by step, with Victoria's guidance. She had secured 3 paying clients within her first month, a stark contrast to her past ventures that had crumbled before they even took off. More importantly, she had done it all without relying on their parents for funding. The final test had come when she needed office space. Victoria had offered her a small commercial unit in one of her rental properties, a modest but professional space where she could meet with clients and work without distraction. But unlike before, Emma hadn't expected special treatment. She had signed a formal lease, paid her deposit, and followed the same process as any other tenant. At first, Richard and Margaret had hesitated. The idea of their daughters having a strictly professional agreement was foreign to them. Family was supposed to help each other, wasn't it? But Victoria had stood firm, and Emma hadn't argued. She had understood that success meant doing things properly, without shortcuts. For the first time, Victoria wasn't just seen as the responsible one. She was seen as an equal. Their parents had their own transformation to navigate. The reality of their financial situation had forced them to change their habits in ways they never thought possible. The business classes at the community college had been humbling for Richard, but he had taken them seriously, learning skills he wished he had known years earlier. Margaret, once oblivious to their reckless spending, had become meticulous about budgeting. It hadn't been easy for them to admit that their daughter had managed money better than they ever had, but with time they stopped resenting it and started learning from her instead. They had grown past the guilt and the shame, replacing it with determination. No more financial secrets. No more blind investments in failing ventures. They were committed to rebuilding. Despite everything, they had all found a way to come back together. Not in the way they once were, but in a way that was healthier. Weekly family dinners had become a tradition, but unlike before, there was no underlying tension, no unspoken expectations. Richard and Margaret no longer treated Victoria as the silent safety net, and Emma no longer acted like the center of their universe. They talked about their individual successes and struggles, not as people depending on each other, but as people supporting one another. One evening as they sat around the dining table, the conversation flowed easily. Emma shared details about her first major client, explaining how she had negotiated a long-term contract. Victoria listened with quiet satisfaction, knowing that months ago, Emma wouldn't have understood the importance of sustainability in business. Richard, in a rare moment of reflection, admitted that one of his professors had used Victoria's real estate strategy as a case study in class. He had sat through the lecture without saying a word, listening as her methods were praised as a masterclass in strategic development. "I didn't tell them you were my daughter," he admitted, shaking his head. "Just listened." Margaret smiled, setting down her glass. "And what did you think?" Richard exhaled, looking across the table at Victoria. "I should have seen it sooner." Victoria didn't need an apology. She had stopped needing validation from them long ago. But hearing the words mattered. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. It was an acknowledgement of who she had always been. Emma, who had been unusually quiet, cleared her throat. "You know, I've been thinking about moving out." Margaret stiffened slightly, but Victoria wasn't surprised. Emma had been growing more independent with each passing month. It was only a matter of time before she realized that living at home wasn't what she wanted anymore. "Not right away," Emma continued, twirling her fork between her fingers. "But soon. I want to start looking for my own place. Do it the right way on my own." Richard studied her for a long moment before nodding. "That's a good idea." Margaret, though clearly emotional, smiled. "We'll support you." Emma grinned. "I mean, you kind of have to. That's what family does, right?" Victoria laughed softly, shaking her head. The irony wasn't lost on her. They had spent so many years enabling Emma's recklessness, assuming she would always need them to catch her when she fell. But now she was choosing to stand on her own. Later that evening, as Victoria drove past the small office space where Emma had set up her business, she felt a quiet sense of pride. Not just for Emma, but for all of them. The house, once a symbol of imbalance and favoritism, had become something else entirely. It had forced them all to change, to grow, to take responsibility. Her phone buzzed with a message from Charlotte. "Charlotte, how's the family situation?" Victoria smiled as she typed back. "Victoria, better. They're learning. We all are." Sometimes the best way to change people wasn't through force or resentment, but through action. She had set boundaries, held firm, and refused to let the past dictate her future. And in doing so, she had given them all a chance to grow. As she pulled into her driveway, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Victoria stood in the doorway of her childhood home, the place that had once been a symbol of warmth and family, but was now something entirely different. She no longer saw it as a sanctuary filled with memories but as an asset, a property she had purchased, a business investment rather than just a place she had grown up in. The shift in perspective wasn't just hers. Her family had started to feel it too. Richard and Margaret moved through the house differently these days. They hesitated before making changes, double-checking whether something needed Victoria's approval. Not because she demanded it, but because they understood now, this wasn't just their home anymore. It belonged to Victoria, and they were living in it under a lease agreement. The sense of entitlement they once had was gone, replaced by an unspoken awareness of the new reality. Margaret had started treating the property with more care, keeping track of maintenance issues and making sure things were in order. Richard, once the dominant force in household decisions, no longer made assumptions about what could be done or spent. If something needed fixing, he didn't just go ahead with it. He asked Victoria first, just as any responsible tenant would with their landlord. Victoria appreciated the change, though she remained firm in enforcing the boundaries that had been so easily crossed in the past. This house was no longer a safety net for their bad financial decisions. If they wanted to continue living here, they needed to handle their responsibilities, just like any other tenant she managed. Emma, however, was still struggling with the transition. She had grown up used to a world where things fell into place for her, where their parents had covered her mistakes and cushioned her from consequences. While she had made real progress in her business, there were still moments where she fought against the reality of financial independence. One evening, Victoria walked into the kitchen to find Emma staring at her laptop, her expression tight with frustration. Victoria poured herself a glass of water before speaking. "What's wrong?" Emma exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. "Clients. They're late on payments, and now I'm short for some of my business expenses this month." She rubbed her temples. "I did everything right this time. I didn't overspend. I budgeted. But I wasn't expecting people to delay payments." Victoria set her glass down and leaned against the counter. "Welcome to running a real business." Emma shot her a glare. "Not helpful." Victoria smirked. "No, but it's the truth. You're dealing with cash flow problems, not overspending. That's new for you." Emma sighed, resting her chin on her hand. "So what do I do?" Victoria sat down across from her. "First, you need to put stricter payment terms in place. Get deposits up front, set clear deadlines, and charge late fees if necessary. You can't afford to be too lenient, or you'll always be waiting on money." Emma nodded slowly, her mind already working through the suggestion. "Yeah, I guess I was too afraid to push people too hard. I didn't want to seem unprofessional." "There's nothing unprofessional about expecting people to pay for the service they agreed to," Victoria said. "If anything, setting boundaries makes you more professional." Emma took a deep breath. "Okay, stricter contracts. Got it." Victoria hesitated for a moment before adding, "And maybe it's time you think about moving out." Emma groaned, leaning back in her chair. "You just had to bring that up, didn't you?" Victoria shrugged. "It's time. You've got a business now. You're making money. But as long as you're living here, you're relying on the comfort of not having to handle every expense on your own. You need to experience the full weight of financial independence." Emma tapped her fingers against the table, clearly processing the idea. "I mean, I've thought about it. But apartments aren't cheap." "They're cheaper than staying stuck," Victoria pointed out. "And if you plan right, you can find a place that fits your budget. Plus, it'll push you to be more aggressive about securing stable revenue for your business." Emma was silent for a moment before she sighed. "I hate it when you make sense." Victoria smirked. "It's a gift." That weekend, Emma started looking at apartments. At first, she browsed half-heartedly, more out of obligation than actual intent. But as she went through listings, something changed. The idea of having her own place, of truly being independent, started to appeal to her. A week later, she stood outside a modest apartment complex, staring up at the building. It wasn't flashy or luxurious, but it was hers if she wanted it. She hesitated before stepping inside, checking her phone. There was a text from Victoria. "Victoria, moving forward is never easy, but staying stuck is worse. You got this." Emma took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked inside. Meanwhile, at home, Richard and Margaret were facing their own challenges. Their business classes had been eye-opening, forcing them to confront the years of financial mismanagement that had nearly cost them everything. Richard, who had once taken pride in handling family finances, now realized how much he had misunderstood about money. One evening, Victoria found him sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by financial statements. His laptop was open, and he was staring at a spreadsheet, rubbing his forehead. "I thought I knew what I was doing," he admitted when he noticed Victoria standing there. "Turns out, I've been playing checkers while everyone else was playing chess." Victoria sat down across from him. "At least you're learning now. That's more than a lot of people can say." Margaret, who had been flipping through a budgeting book, smiled. "He's actually been helping me track household expenses. We've never really done that before." Victoria was surprised but pleased. "That's a good start." Richard sighed. "It's humbling, knowing that my own daughter was making better financial decisions than I was." He looked up at her. "I should have paid more attention to what you were doing." Victoria didn't need an apology, but hearing the words mattered. "What matters is what you do now," she said simply. By the end of the month, Emma had signed a lease for her first apartment. Richard and Margaret had finalized a proper household budget for the first time in their marriage. The house that had once been filled with resentment and misplaced priorities was now a place of accountability and growth. One evening during their weekly family dinner, the conversation felt different. Not forced or tense but balanced. Emma talked about her business, Richard shared what he had learned in class, and Margaret proudly announced that she had successfully balanced the monthly household expenses. Victoria listened, sipping her wine, and realized something. She had once believed that proving herself meant taking control, that the only way to show them she was capable was by making them depend on her authority. But sitting at that table, watching them hold themselves accountable, she understood. The real victory wasn't in control. It was in letting go. It was in watching them stand on their own. Richard sat in the back of the community college classroom, tapping his pen against his notebook as the professor went over the fundamentals of financial management. He had always believed he was good with money, that managing a household and making big financial decisions were second nature to him. But as he listened to the lecture on debt, saving strategies, and long-term financial planning, he realized just how little he had truly understood. Margaret sat beside him, taking diligent notes, occasionally glancing at her husband. She could see the frustration in his posture, the way he tensed every time the professor explained a concept that contradicted how they had handled their finances for years. She knew this was difficult for him, admitting that he had been wrong, that his financial decisions had nearly cost them everything. But at least he was here learning, making the effort to change. At first, the business classes had been overwhelming. The technical jargon, the formulas for calculating interest, the strategies for managing debt, it was all foreign to them. But as the weeks went on, they started to get the hang of it. They asked questions, completed assignments, and even stayed after class a few times to go over concepts they didn't fully understand. At home, their learning didn't stop. Margaret had taken charge of the household budget, something she had never done before. She created spreadsheets to track expenses, set limits for discretionary spending, and made sure every dollar was accounted for. Richard, who had once dismissed budgeting as unnecessary, now sat beside her every evening, going over their finances together. One evening, Victoria found them in the kitchen, the table covered in financial documents, their laptops open. Richard looked up as she entered, rubbing his forehead. "We've been going over everything," he admitted, trying to figure out how to get back on track. Margaret glanced at the screen, where a pie chart displayed their monthly expenses. "We've already cut unnecessary spending by almost 20%, she said proudly, "and we're working on building an emergency fund." Victoria folded her arms, nodding approvingly. "That's real progress." Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. I just keep thinking, if we had done this years ago, we wouldn't have ended up in this mess. Margaret placed a hand on his arm. We can't change the past, Richard. We can only do better now. Victoria sat down across from them, her expression softer than usual. You are doing better. And honestly, I respect that. A lot of people in your position would just give up or keep making the same mistakes. But you're putting in the effort to fix things. Richard exhaled slowly, nodding. It's humbling. But you were right about everything, Victoria. And I hate that I didn't see it sooner. Victoria gave a small smile. What matters is that you see it now. Meanwhile, Emma was dealing with her own turning point. After weeks of browsing apartment listings half-heartedly, she finally started taking the process seriously. The idea of leaving the family home had always been daunting. She had never lived completely on her own before. There was always someone around to help her, whether it was her parents or, more recently, Victoria. But now, she understood that staying in the house was keeping her dependent. One afternoon, she sat in a coffee shop with her laptop open, scrolling through listings. She had narrowed it down to a few affordable options, each within her budget, but she hesitated before clicking on any of them. Victoria arrived a few minutes later, placing her coffee on the table and sitting across from Emma. Making progress? Emma sighed. Yeah, I found a couple of places, but I don't know. It's a big step. Victoria nodded. It is. But it's also the next step. Emma hesitated, scrolling through the listings again. What if I fail? Victoria leaned forward slightly. Then you figure it out. That's what being independent is about. You've already built something real with your business. This is just another challenge to tackle. Emma exhaled slowly. I guess I keep waiting for the perfect time, but I don't think there's ever a perfect time, is there? Victoria smirked. Nope. You just have to go for it. A few days later, Emma scheduled her first apartment viewing. She stood outside the building, staring up at it with a mix of excitement and nerves. It wasn't glamorous or high-end, but it was hers if she wanted it. When she stepped inside, she took in the modest but functional space. A small living room, a kitchenette, a bedroom just big enough for her bed and desk. It wasn't what she had always imagined for herself, but it was real. It was a step toward something bigger. After the tour, she sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel. She could hear Victoria's words in her head. Moving forward is never easy, but staying stuck is worse. With a deep breath, she pulled out her phone and sent a message to the landlord. I'd like to move forward with the lease. Later that evening, she shared the news with her parents at dinner. Richard and Margaret exchanged a look, clearly surprised but trying not to show it. That's big, Margaret said, setting down her fork. Are you sure you're ready? Emma nodded. Yeah, I need to do this. Richard cleared his throat. Well, you know we're here for you if you need anything. Emma smiled. Thanks. But I think I'll be okay. Victoria watched the exchange, a quiet pride settling in her chest. This was the Emma she had always hoped to see. Taking responsibility, making her own decisions, stepping out of the shadow of comfort. The next week was filled with packing. Emma sorted through her belongings, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. Margaret fussed over little things, making sure Emma had everything she needed for her new place. Richard offered to help with the move, though Emma insisted she could handle it herself. On moving day, Victoria stood outside the apartment as Emma carried in the first few boxes. You nervous? Emma huffed, setting down a box. Terrified. Victoria chuckled. Good. That means you're doing something right. Emma rolled her eyes but grinned. You always have to be the wise older sister, don't you? Victoria smirked. It's a full-time job. As Emma unpacked her things, setting up her new space, she realized how different this felt from every other time she had started something new. This wasn't another short-lived business idea, another passing phase. This was real. That evening she sat in her new living room, sipping a cup of tea, surrounded by boxes yet to be unpacked. She had done it. She had taken the leap. Meanwhile, back at the family home, Richard and Margaret sat in their newly organized kitchen, reviewing their budget for the next month. They had come a long way from the reckless spending and financial chaos that had nearly cost them their house. Victoria, watching them from across the room, knew that things would never go back to the way they were before. And she didn't want them to. For the first time, everyone in her family was standing on their own. Victoria sat at her desk, reviewing the latest rental application for one of her properties. The name on the form, Claire Reynolds, was new to her, but the financial history attached to it was all too familiar. Claire had a steady income and met all the technical requirements, but her history of late payments raised a red flag. Victoria had seen this pattern before: people who wanted to do better but struggled with the discipline to follow through. Instead of rejecting the application outright, she decided to meet Claire in person. The next afternoon, Claire arrived at Victoria's office, a nervous energy surrounding her. She was in her late 20s, dressed professionally, but her anxious fidgeting suggested she knew exactly what Victoria had noticed in her records. Victoria listened as Claire explained her past financial missteps. She had spent years living paycheck to paycheck, spending impulsively, and failing to track her expenses. Only when she had to borrow money from her parents to cover rent did she realize how out of control things had become. That moment of embarrassment had forced her to make changes, budgeting, saving, and paying her bills on time. But history didn't disappear overnight, and she knew that her application still carried the weight of her past mistakes. Victoria considered her words carefully. She had no interest in renting to someone who would default on payments, but she also knew that people could change if given the right tools. Her own family had been proof of that. 6 months ago, Richard and Margaret had been dangerously close to financial ruin, unable to acknowledge the damage they had done to themselves. Now they were actively rebuilding their financial lives. Emma had once dismissed the importance of budgeting, assuming that things would always work out for her. Now she was running her own business with careful planning. Instead of declining the application, Victoria offered Claire a compromise. She would approve the lease, but Claire had to enroll in a financial literacy course within the next 2 months. It wasn't just about proving responsibility. It was about giving her the tools to make lasting changes. Claire agreed immediately, visibly relieved that someone was willing to give her a chance. After Claire left, Victoria sat in her office, reflecting on how much her own mindset had evolved. At the beginning of this journey, she had been focused on proving herself, on enforcing boundaries with an iron grip. Now she saw the bigger picture. It wasn't just about drawing lines. It was about guiding people toward accountability. Her family had needed strict lessons at first, but over time they had adapted. And if her own family could learn, so could others. That realization became even clearer at their next family dinner. For the first time in years, the table felt balanced, the conversation natural. No one was walking on eggshells. No one was silently resenting the other. Each person had something real to contribute. Emma shared updates about her business and how she had fully adjusted to living in her own apartment. She had finally found satisfaction in financial independence, recognizing the freedom that came with knowing exactly where her money was going. Margaret, once oblivious to household expenses, proudly discussed how she had successfully balanced their monthly budget without struggling to make ends meet. Richard, who had once dismissed the importance of financial planning, recounted a discussion he had in class about forecasting income and managing investments. Victoria listened, not with skepticism but with genuine pride. They had come so far from where they had been 6 months ago. She no longer had to shoulder the responsibility of keeping everything from falling apart. They had taken control of their own lives, and for the first time, she didn't feel the weight of being the family's unacknowledged safety net. Later that night, as Victoria sat at her desk, her phone buzzed with a message from Charlotte. It was a simple question, but one that made Victoria pause. What's next for you? For so long, her biggest goal had been helping her family stand on their own. Now that they had, she was free to think about her own future. The thought was both exhilarating and a little unnerving. She had spent so much time managing their crises that she hadn't fully considered what she wanted to do beyond them. After a long moment, she typed back her response. Something big. A few days later, Victoria met Charlotte for coffee. The conversation drifted to business as it always did, but this time Victoria had a new vision. She was ready to expand, beyond residential properties, beyond single-family investments. She wanted to move into commercial real estate, into larger projects with higher stakes. The idea had been forming in her mind for months, but she had always held back, waiting until she was certain her family wouldn't fall apart without her. Now she didn't have to wait any longer. Charlotte listened, nodding in approval. Victoria was no longer just the responsible daughter proving herself. She was a businesswoman with a clear plan, no longer bound by her family's past mistakes. As Victoria walked back to her car, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. This story wasn't over. It was just evolving just like she was. The story of Victoria's transformation, from being the overlooked, responsible daughter to a confident property owner and businesswoman, offers valuable lessons that are highly applicable in 2025. In an era where financial independence, generational wealth, and entrepreneurship are becoming essential for long-term stability, Victoria's journey underscores the importance of accountability, strategic planning, and personal growth. One of the key takeaways from the story is financial literacy. Victoria's family struggled because they lacked the knowledge to manage money effectively. Richard and Margaret's tendency to fund Emma's ventures without understanding the risks led to their financial downfall. However, their eventual willingness to learn and take control of their finances highlights an important lesson. It is never too late to educate ourselves about financial management. In 2025, with the rise of digital banking, cryptocurrency, and decentralized finance, financial literacy is more critical than ever. Understanding investments, budgeting, and cash flow can prevent individuals from making reckless decisions that could jeopardize their future. Another crucial lesson is the power of boundaries and self-respect. Victoria's initial struggle stemmed from being taken for granted. She contributed financially without acknowledgement, while her family continued to enable Emma's reckless spending. The moment she reclaimed her power, by purchasing the house and enforcing lease agreements, she established necessary boundaries. In 2025, personal and professional boundaries remain vital, especially as more people navigate work-life balance in remote or hybrid job environments. Learning when to say no, setting clear expectations, and holding people accountable are essential skills for maintaining personal and financial well-being. The story also highlights the transition from dependence to independence. Emma's growth represents the importance of stepping out of one's comfort zone. Many young adults today, especially in challenging economic conditions, struggle with taking the leap into full independence. Emma's decision to move out and manage her business properly serves as a reminder that real growth happens outside of comfort. Ultimately, this story teaches us that success is not about luck or privilege, but about discipline, planning, and adaptability. Victoria's ability to think ahead, make smart financial decisions, and continuously evolve is what sets her apart. Whether in personal finance, career growth, or business ventures, the principles of accountability, education, and strategic thinking remain timeless, especially in a rapidly changing world like 2025. Victoria's journey has been one of resilience, strategy, and self-discovery. She transformed from the dependable daughter, overlooked and taken for granted, into a successful property owner and business leader. She set boundaries, held her family accountable, and ultimately helped them grow into financially responsible individuals. But now that she has achieved her initial goal, the question remains, what's next for her? After years of focusing on her family's stability, It's finally time for Victoria to prioritize her own future. Should she continue expanding her real estate business and move into commercial properties, building a larger investment portfolio? Or should she use her experiences to mentor others, helping young entrepreneurs and families avoid the financial mistakes she has witnessed firsthand? Perhaps she should take an entirely new path, relocating to a new city or exploring opportunities beyond real estate. Now it's your turn to shape the next chapter of Victoria's story. What do you think she should do next? Should she scale up her business, focus on mentoring, or take a bold leap in an unexpected direction? Share your thoughts and suggestions in the comments. Your ideas could determine her next big move. Let's continue this journey together and help Victoria step into her future with confidence.